Typical, the officer muttered, just loud enough for it to land. And in that single word the night shifted, tightening around Marcus Reed like an invisible grip he had learned not to fight. His palms rested flat against the warm hood of his car, the metal still holding the heat of a long summer drive. And he focused on that warmth, on the steady rise and fall of his breath, because anything sudden, anything sharp, could be misunderstood, and misunderstandings had consequences he knew too well. The red and blue lights spun across the quiet suburban street, washing over trimmed lawns and parked SUVs, turning ordinary driveways into something colder, something watchful, and the hum of the cruiser's engine blended with the distant buzz of cicadas, a sound that should have felt like home, but now carried a tension that pressed against the skin. Behind him, Angela Reed stepped out of the passenger side slowly, carefully, her movements deliberate, measured down to the inch, her heels clicking softly against the asphalt before she stopped, not too close, not too far, her eyes taking in everything. The angle of the officer's stance, the second cruiser pulling up behind them, the way one officer's hand hovered just slightly closer to his belt than necessary. She didn't speak, not yet, because she understood something most people didn't in moments like this. Silence wasn't weakness, it was observation. And observation was control. Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted his grip on Marcus's wrist, not forceful, but firm enough to assert ownership over the situation. His jaw set, his gaze fixed somewhere just past Marcus as if the man in front of him was already reduced to a category, a checkbox, a line in a report waiting to be filled. License and registration, he said, though they had already been handed over. The words less about information and more about reinforcement, about reminding everyone present who dictated the terms of the moment. Marcus swallowed, the dry air catching in his throat, and nodded slightly. A small movement, careful, controlled, because even acknowledgement had to be calibrated. Angela's gaze shifted to the second officer stepping out of the newly arrived cruiser, younger, quieter, his eyes flicking between Marcus and Brooks, uncertainty buried under training, and for a brief second, she saw it. The hesitation, the space where a different choice could exist. And then it was gone, replaced by alignment, by the unspoken agreement that whatever happened next would follow the same script it always did. A car passed slowly at the end of the street, its headlights sweeping across the scene before disappearing, the driver choosing not to stop, not to look too long, because this was not their moment to enter. Angela exhaled softly, the night air cool against her skin, and finally stepped forward just enough for her voice to carry, calm, even, cutting clean through the static tension without raising in volume. "Officer," she said, her tone steady, almost neutral, "what is the reason for the stop?" And the question hung there, precise, controlled, not confrontational but not submissive either, a line drawn not with force, but with clarity. Brooks glanced at her, just briefly, and something in his expression shifted. Not recognition, not yet, but awareness. As if her composure didn't fit the role he had already assigned to the scene. The lights continued to spin, painting her face in alternating shades of red and blue. But her eyes remained unchanged, focused, unflinching, and in that stillness, in that refusal to mirror the tension around her, something subtle began to tilt, almost imperceptible, like the first crack in a surface that had always seemed unbreakable. Marcus kept his eyes on the hood, on the faint outline of his own reflection stretched across the metallic surface, distorted by the spinning lights, and he let that reflection anchor him, because it was easier to focus on something still than to track the shifting energy around him. He had finished a 10-hour shift pouring concrete on the north side of town, his shoulders still carrying the dull weight of the day, his boots dusted in pale gray, and all he had wanted was to get home, take a shower, and sit in the quiet with Angela, maybe watch something mindless, something that did not require thinking about anything beyond the next hour. But now time had stretched, slowed into something deliberate, something every second longer than it should be. Angela stood just behind the invisible line she had drawn for herself, her posture relaxed but intentional, her hands visible at her sides, fingers still, no sudden movements, and yet there was a quiet precision in the way she positioned herself, angled just enough to see both officers without turning her head too sharply, her gaze moving in small, controlled shifts that missed nothing. Officer Brooks did not answer her question immediately, and that silence was not empty. It was filled with assumption, with the weight of authority that expected compliance without explanation. And when he finally spoke, his tone carried that expectation clearly. "You were swerving back there," he said, though his eyes did not meet Marcus's, instead scanning the street as if confirmation could be found in the darkness itself. Marcus frowned slightly, a small crease forming between his brows, because he knew he had not swerved. He had driven that same route for years, knew every turn, every uneven patch of asphalt. But he did not argue, not yet, because arguing too early could be mistaken for something else. Angela tilted her head just slightly, the smallest shift, and asked, "Where exactly?" Her voice still calm, not pressing, just precise. And the specificity of the question seemed to land differently, as if it required more than a rehearsed response. The younger officer glanced at Brooks again, just for a fraction of a second, and Angela caught it. That flicker of uncertainty, that brief moment where the narrative had not fully settled. A porch light clicked on across the street, casting a soft yellow glow onto the sidewalk, and somewhere a screen door creaked open, the quiet curiosity of neighbors beginning to gather at the edges of the scene, unseen but present. Their attention adding another layer to the atmosphere. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, careful, slow, the fabric of his shirt brushing softly against the car, and Brooks's hand tightened just enough to signal awareness, a silent reminder that every movement was being measured, interpreted. Angela noticed that too. The subtle change, the tightening of control, and her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened, not in anger, but in clarity, as if a line had been drawn internally, a threshold crossed not by volume, but by accumulation. The night air moved gently through the street, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant asphalt, ordinary details that felt out of place in a moment that was anything but ordinary. And Angela took a slow breath, steady, deliberate, grounding herself in that same way Marcus had grounded himself against the warmth of the hood. "Officer," she said again, this time with just a touch more firmness, not louder, just clearer, "we would like to understand what is happening." And the words settled into the space between them, not as a challenge, but as a request that carried weight, the kind of weight that did not come from volume or force, but from certainty. And for the first time, Brooks looked directly at her, really looked, as if trying to place something he could not quite name, something that did not fit the pattern he had already decided this moment would follow. Officer Brooks held her gaze a second longer than before, and in that second something subtle shifted, not in authority but in awareness, as if the script he had been following no longer fit as cleanly as it had a moment ago. He straightened slightly, adjusting his stance, his hand still resting near Marcus's wrist, but no longer tightening, just present, controlled, and his voice when it came was firmer, more deliberate, as though he was choosing each word instead of letting them fall. "Automatically, we received a report," he said, pausing just enough to make it sound official. "Vehicle matching this description driving erratically about 2 miles back." And the explanation hung there, thin but structured, an attempt to anchor the situation in procedure. Angela listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, but her eyes tracked the details, the hesitation between words, the lack of specifics, the way the younger officer shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other as if standing on something uncertain. Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and spoke carefully, his voice low but clear. "I came straight down Maple and turned onto Ridge, same as always." And there was no defensiveness in his tone, just fact, grounded and simple, the kind that did not need to be dressed up. The neighborhood remained quiet, but not empty. The faint silhouettes of people now visible behind curtains, on porches, watching without stepping forward, their presence like a low hum beneath the scene, adding pressure without sound. Angela let a brief silence settle after Marcus spoke, not rushing to fill it, allowing the weight of his words to exist on their own, and then she asked, "Did the report include a license plate?" Her voice steady, precise, each question narrowing the space for assumption. Brooks hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to be noticed. Enough to register in the careful attention. Angela held on every movement, and when he answered, "No," just the make and color. It sounded less certain than before, less anchored, like something built quickly instead of something observed. The younger officer glanced again toward Brooks, then toward the cruiser, then back to Marcus, his posture tightening slightly, as if unsure where to place himself within the moment. A breeze moved through the street, lifting a loose receipt near the curb and carrying it a few feet before it settled. Again, a small, ordinary motion that somehow felt louder than it should have. Marcus shifted his fingers slightly against the hood, not pulling away, just adjusting, grounding himself again in the warmth that was beginning to fade as the night air settled in, and Brooks noticed, his eyes flicking down briefly, then back up, recalibrating without speaking. Angela took one small step forward, still within a respectful distance, her presence now more centered in the space between them, and there was something in the way she stood, balanced, composed, that no longer aligned with the role Brooks had assumed at the beginning of the stop. "So to be clear," she said, her tone still calm, but now carrying a quiet firmness that did not need to rise to be felt. There was no plate, no confirmed driver, and no observed behavior from this vehicle before the stop. And as the words settled, they did not accuse, they clarified. But that clarity carried its own weight, narrowing the narrative down to what was actually known rather than what had been assumed. Brooks's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the recognition that the moment had shifted, that control was no longer as one-sided as it had seemed under the flashing lights, and for the first time, the night felt less like something being directed and more like something being examined. The air felt tighter now, not louder, not more chaotic, but sharper, like every word carried an edge that had not been there before, and Officer Brooks seemed to feel it too, his shoulders squaring slightly, as if trying to regain the structure of a moment that had begun slipping out of its original shape. He shifted his stance, repositioning himself just a fraction closer to Marcus, not enough to escalate, but enough to reassert presence. And when he spoke again, his tone carried a firmer weight. "Less explanation, more control. Step out of the vehicle," he said, even though Marcus was already outside, the instruction landing out of sequence, revealing more about intention than necessity. Marcus did not react immediately, his hands still resting on the hood, his breathing even, and he turned his head just slightly, enough to be heard but not enough to be seen as resisting. "I am already out, sir," he said quietly, the words simple, grounded, leaving no space for misinterpretation, and that simplicity seemed to hang in the air longer than expected. The younger officer glanced at Brooks again, his brow tightening just slightly, as if the rhythm of the stop no longer matched the steps he had been trained to follow, and for a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face before being replaced by stillness. Angela watched all of it, the micro shifts, the subtle misalignments, the way authority was now being maintained through repetition instead of clarity, and she understood what that meant, not emotionally, but structurally, like recognizing a pattern that had begun to break down under its own weight. A car slowed at the end of the block, its headlights dimming as the driver paused just long enough to observe before continuing on, and the presence of witnesses, even distant ones, added another invisible layer to the scene, one that could not be ignored even if no one spoke. Angela took a small step forward again, her movement controlled, deliberate, closing just enough distance to ensure her voice would not need to rise. And she kept her hands visible, fingers relaxed, every detail intentional. "Officer," she said, her tone unchanged but now carrying a quiet authority that had not been fully visible before. "We are cooperating, and we are asking for clarity." And the phrasing was careful, not confrontational, but firm in a way that did not ask permission to be heard. Brooks exhaled through his nose, a subtle release of tension, but his jaw remained set, his gaze moving between Marcus and Angela as if recalculating the situation in real time. And for the first time, there was a trace of something beneath the surface of his expression, not doubt exactly, but awareness that the narrative was no longer fully his to control. Marcus shifted his weight slightly again, the warmth of the hood now fading into something cooler under his palms, and he focused on that change, that grounding detail, because it reminded him that time was still moving, that this moment, however stretched, was not permanent. The porch light across the street flickered once, then steadied, casting a clearer outline of the scene onto the pavement. And in that steadier light, Angela's posture became even more defined, centered, composed in a way that did not match the role Brooks had assigned at the start. And he saw it now, not fully understood, but enough to register. "You are asking questions," Brooks said finally, his voice measured. But there was a shift in it now, less certainty, more caution, when you should be following instructions. And the statement was meant to restore order, to re-establish hierarchy. But it did not land the same way it would have minutes earlier, because the ground beneath that hierarchy had already begun to shift, quietly, steadily, in ways that could not be reversed simply by repeating the script. The words settled between them, not loud, not aggressive, but heavy in a way that pressed against the quiet street. And for a moment no one moved, not because they could not, but because something invisible had reached its peak, a tension that no longer came from raised voices or sudden motion, but from the simple fact that two different versions of the moment now existed at the same time. Marcus felt it first in the stillness of his hands, the way the cooling metal beneath his palms no longer anchored him the same way, because the situation had shifted from something predictable into something uncertain, and uncertainty was harder to navigate than pressure, because it did not follow clear rules. Officer Brooks adjusted his grip again, not tightening, not loosening, just repositioning, as if trying to find a balance that would restore the structure he was used to. And his eyes flicked briefly toward the second cruiser, toward the quiet presence of backup that had not yet spoken but was now fully part of the scene. The younger officer took a small step forward, then stopped, as if unsure whether he was entering the situation or observing it, and that hesitation lingered just long enough to be felt by everyone present, even if no one acknowledged it out loud. Angela watched that movement carefully, the almost step, the pause, the retreat into stillness, and she understood what it meant, not emotionally, but procedurally, like a signal that the situation had reached a point where the next action would define everything that followed. A faint sound of a phone camera activating came from somewhere across the street, subtle but unmistakable, the soft click barely audible, yet somehow louder than any spoken word. And with it came the quiet awareness that this moment was no longer contained, that it existed beyond the immediate space, being observed, recorded, held. Brooks seemed to register it too, his posture tightening just slightly, his voice lowering rather than rising when he spoke again. "Ma'am, you need to step back." And this time there was less force in the command, more caution, as if the presence of unseen witnesses had shifted the weight of his authority. Angela did not step back immediately, but she did not move forward either, holding her position with a stillness that felt intentional rather than resistant. And when she spoke, her tone remained calm, but there was a clarity in it now that cut through the layered tension. "We are standing still, we are cooperating, and we are asking for a reason that holds." And the phrasing was deliberate, not emotional, not reactive, but structured in a way that made it difficult to dismiss without addressing. Marcus swallowed again, his throat dry, and spoke carefully, choosing each word as if placing it on a scale. "Sir, I just want to understand what you need from me." And there was no challenge in his voice, only a quiet request that carried more weight than volume ever could. Brooks exhaled slowly, his gaze moving between them, and for a brief second, something unguarded passed across his face. Not doubt exactly, but recognition that the situation was no longer simple, no longer one direction, and that whatever came next would not be easily contained. The streetlight above flickered once more, then steadied again, casting a consistent glow over the scene, and in that steady light, the lines between authority and accountability felt thinner, more visible, as if the moment itself was waiting, suspended, for a decision that had not yet been made, but could not be avoided much longer. For a brief moment, nothing moved, not the officers, not Marcus, not even the distant figures watching from behind dimly lit windows, and it was in that stillness that the entire scene seemed to exhale, as if the tension had reached a point where it could no longer rise and instead began to settle into something quieter, something more revealing. Marcus felt it in the way his shoulders loosened just slightly, not because the situation had ended, but because the uncertainty had shifted into something he could recognize, a pause, a space where decisions were made not through force but through awareness. and he focused on that space, on the rhythm of his breathing, on the faint hum of the cruiser engine behind him. Angela lowered her gaze for a second, not in submission, but in thought, her eyes tracing the faint reflection of the flashing lights across the pavement, watching how the colors stretched and faded with each rotation, red into blue, blue into red, a cycle that felt endless until it wasn't. And in that simple pattern she found clarity, the kind that did not come from reacting, but from choosing. The younger officer shifted again, this time more noticeably, his weight settling unevenly before he corrected himself. And he glanced toward Brooks with a question he did not voice, something unspoken but present, as if waiting for direction that had not yet come. Brooks remained still, his posture firm but no longer rigid, his gaze no longer scanning for compliance but holding on the space between Angela and Marcus. And there was something different in his expression now, not softened, not apologetic, but aware, as if the structure he relied on had been replaced by something less certain, something that required judgment instead of assumption. A faint breeze moved through the street again, carrying with it the scent of warm asphalt and distant trees, and somewhere a wind chime stirred, a soft, irregular sound that cut gently through the tension without breaking it. Angela lifted her head again, her expression composed, her breathing steady, and she did not rush to speak, allowing the silence to remain intact just a moment longer, because she understood. That silence, when held properly, could say more than words ever could. Marcus shifted his fingers once more against the hood, feeling now the full coolness of the metal beneath his skin, the heat completely gone, replaced by something neutral, something steady, and he drew a slow breath, grounding himself again in that sensation. The streetlight above them steadied fully now, its glow consistent, casting clear outlines of every figure, every movement, every pause. And in that clarity, the scene no longer felt like something hidden or controlled, but something visible, something accountable. Brooks finally inhaled, a measured breath, and though he did not speak yet, the act itself signaled a shift, a recognition that whatever came next would not simply follow the pattern that had begun this stop. Angela's posture remained unchanged, balanced, centered, her presence calm but unmistakably firm. And as she stood there, not moving forward, not stepping back, it became clear that the moment had reached a quiet turning point, not marked by raised voices or sudden action, but by the simple realization that the power in the situation was no longer one-sided. And that realization, more than anything else, was what held the night in place. Angela did not move right away, and that was the first thing that changed everything. Not a gesture, not a raised voice, just the absence of motion where action might have been expected. And in that stillness, she reached slowly into the inside pocket of her coat, her movements deliberate, unhurried, every inch controlled so there could be no misunderstanding, no sudden shift that could be interpreted as anything other than intention. Marcus felt the subtle change beside him before he saw it. The way the air seemed to tighten again, but in a different direction, not closing in, but focusing, narrowing toward a single point. And he kept his hands exactly where they were, trusting the calm he had learned from her over years, the kind of calm that did not react, but responded. Officer Brooks's eyes tracked her hand immediately, instinct sharp, posture adjusting just slightly, not aggressive, but alert, his attention locking onto the motion with the precision of training, while the younger officer mirrored the shift a second later, his stance straightening as if pulled into alignment by the change in energy. Angela's fingers closed around something small and flat, and she brought it out slowly, holding it between her thumb and forefinger, not raising it high, not presenting it dramatically, just letting it exist in the space where it could be seen without being forced. The streetlight caught the edge of it first, a faint glint, then the reflection sharpened, metal, catching light in a way that was unmistakable once noticed, and Brooks's gaze dropped to it, his focus narrowing. The rest of the scene fading slightly as his attention locked onto that single detail. She flipped it open with a quiet, precise motion, the soft click barely audible, but in the silence it carried weight, and for a fraction of a second no one spoke, because recognition did not arrive as a word, it arrived as a pause, as a break in the expected rhythm of the moment. The letters were clear, clean, undeniable, and Angela did not need to say them out loud for them to be understood, but she did. Anyway, her voice even, measured, carrying no edge, only fact, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the words did not rise, they settled, like something placed carefully onto a surface that could not reject it. Brooks's hand shifted, not pulling away quickly, not jerking, just loosening. The grip that had been maintained out of assumption now recalibrating under recognition. And his posture changed in a way that was almost imperceptible but unmistakable, the rigid certainty replaced by something more measured, more cautious. The younger officer blinked once, his eyes moving from the badge to Angela's face, then back again, as if confirming what he was seeing matched what he understood, and the quiet hum of the cruiser seemed louder now, filling the space that words had not yet returned to. Marcus felt the pressure ease, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to notice, enough to shift the weight in his chest. And he remained still, because he understood that this moment was not about movement. It was about recognition, about what happened when perception met reality. Angela held the badge steady for another second, then lowered it slightly, not hiding it, not emphasizing it, just allowing it to remain present without dominating the space. And her eyes met Brooks's again, calm, unwavering, not confrontational, but clear in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The street seemed to hold its breath, the distant observers now completely silent. The wind stilled, the lights steady, and in that quiet, the balance that had been uneven just moments ago shifted fully, not with force, not with sound, but with the simple, undeniable weight of truth revealed. The silence did not break all at once. It unfolded slowly, like something carefully unwrapped, and Officer Brooks was the first to move, not with authority, but with adjustment, his hand easing away fully now, stepping back just half a pace as if recalibrating the distance between himself and Marcus. And that half step said more than any apology could have, because it acknowledged what had just shifted without needing to name it. Marcus straightened gradually, not abruptly, not in defiance, but in quiet reclamation of space, his hands leaving the hood at a natural pace, his shoulders rolling back slightly as he took in a deeper breath, the kind that filled his chest fully for the first time since the stop began. And he did not look at Brooks immediately. He looked forward, grounding himself in the street, in the steady light, in the ordinary world that had momentarily been suspended. The younger officer lowered his gaze briefly, then adjusted his stance, his posture no longer rigid but neutral, as if stepping out of a role he had not fully understood while he was in it. And he glanced toward Angela once more, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to recognition, the quiet awareness that the situation had been different from the beginning. Even if he had not seen it at first, Brooks cleared his throat softly, the sound controlled, measured, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, not weaker, but more deliberate, stripped of assumption. "Ma'am," he said, pausing just slightly before continuing. "We were responding to a call, but it appears we may need to reassess the situation." And the phrasing was careful, professional, but beneath it was an acknowledgement that the certainty he had started with no longer held. Angela listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, and she gave a small nod, not as approval, not as submission, but as recognition that the tone had shifted into something more aligned with clarity. The distant phone camera lowered slightly, the unseen observer perhaps sensing that the moment had passed its peak, that what remained was not spectacle but understanding. And the porch light across the street flickered once before settling again, casting a softer glow now that the tension had eased. Marcus turned his head slightly toward Angela, just enough to meet her eyes for a brief second, and in that glance there was no need for words, only a shared understanding of what had just happened, of how quickly perception could shape reality and how quietly it could be corrected. Brooks took another small step back, creating a clearer space between himself and Marcus, and his hand dropped fully to his side, no longer hovering, no longer signaling control, and for a moment he seemed to search for the next step, not in authority, but in procedure, as if returning to a framework that now required precision rather than assumption. Angela lowered the badge fully, but did not put it away yet, allowing it to remain visible just enough to maintain the clarity that had been established, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, steady, but now carried a quiet finality. "We appreciate professionalism," she said. The words simple, but weighted, not a demand, not a critique, but a standard placed gently into the space between them. The night resumed its natural rhythm, the hum of engines softer, the wind moving again through the trees, and the moment that had once felt suspended now began to move forward, not with force, but with understanding, as if the balance that had been restored did not need to be announced, only recognized. The space between them settled into something quiet and steady, no longer charged, no longer uncertain, just present. And Marcus took one final breath before stepping fully away from the car, his movements natural now, unmeasured, as if the invisible weight that had pressed against him had lifted without needing to be acknowledged. The cool night air met his face evenly, no longer sharp, no longer heavy, and he rolled his shoulders once, slow and controlled, letting the tension leave without making a show of it, because there was nothing to prove, nothing to reclaim beyond simply standing where he already belonged. Angela closed the badge with a soft click and slipped it back into her coat, the motion smooth, unhurried, not hidden but no longer necessary to display, and as she did, the last visible marker of authority faded from the scene, leaving only presence, only composure, only the quiet clarity she had carried from the beginning. Officer Brooks nodded once, a small, contained gesture, his expression composed but different now, the certainty replaced with something more measured, and he stepped back another half-pace, creating space that did not need to be negotiated, space that simply existed. And when he spoke, his voice remained even. "You are free to go." And the words landed cleanly, without tension, without resistance. Just a conclusion that no longer needed explanation. The younger officer turned slightly toward the cruiser, his posture relaxed now, his earlier uncertainty replaced with quiet reflection, as if the moment had settled somewhere deeper than routine, somewhere that would remain long after the lights were gone. Across the street, a curtain shifted back into place, the unseen observers returning to their own lives, their brief presence dissolving into the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood, and the phone that had been raised moments before lowered completely, its silent witness complete. Marcus reached for the car door, his hand steady, and paused just for a fraction of a second before opening it, not because he hesitated, but because he allowed himself that brief stillness, that quiet acknowledgement of what had passed without needing to speak it. Angela moved beside him, her steps light, measured, and as she reached the passenger side, she glanced once more at Brooks, not with challenge, not with judgment, but with a calm recognition that needed no words. And then she opened the door and sat down, her posture unchanged, her presence as composed as it had been from the first moment. The engine started with a low, familiar hum, and as Marcus pulled the car back onto the road, the flashing lights behind them faded gradually, shrinking into the distance until they were no longer visible. Just another part of the night left behind. The street returned fully to itself. Quiet, steady, the wind moving gently through the trees, the porch lights glowing softly, and the moment that had once stretched time now folded back into memory, leaving behind no noise, no spectacle, only the quiet weight of understanding. Inside the car, neither of them spoke right away, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood, and as they drove forward into the open road, the silence between them was not empty, it was full, steady, and certain, like something restored that had never truly been lost.